So yes, rules are rules, but our rules can change from day to day. Right, so what does that mean?
By thinking in this way as a rule-based order is we are here to get out of the international system. The new rules are negotiated bilaterally, and we don't care about the system. What do you think is going on with the tariffs? What is the policy behind?
I think it's a mix. That's what you read. So he seems to be completely obsessed by trade deficits, bilateral trade deficits, right? And if you read the stories about this is apparently something he's been saying since the 1970s, right? So here's a guy who has had this bee in his bonnet for 50 years that bilateral trade deficits are bad, and now he's finally in a position to say, okay, I'm going to deal.
Yeah, are they bad? I mean, as an economist,
No economist will say bilateral deficits are bad because they're a function of many things, but starting, comparative advantage, right? So if you don't have a lot of the stuff I have, I'll export it to you, and if you don't have a lot of stuff I want, then you export less to me, and we have a deficit. And why is that bad? It's not, because overall, globally, it'll balance out.
Yeah, but he seems to think that is...
and that's completely, economically it's incoherent, but it's clear that that's the trigger point for him. But I think what's striking about the whole situation is that there's a lot of incoherent arguments being put forward, right? So we need to get rid of bilateral deficits, but we also need to use tariffs to raise revenue, right? We also need to have tariffs to attract investment back into the United States, right? So that's a bit more of a modern argument, which is what the economists call the tariff jumping rationale for investment. But ultimately, I think a lot of what we're seeing, and I think there's obviously a lot of attention being placed on trying to figure out who's being hit and what will it do and how will trade reallocate. So that's very much going on in my world. But I think what's really driving this is just, the Liberation Day, right? So, and I think so Trump called this Liberation Day, and what is the U.S. being liberated from? It's being liberated from international law, right? And that's really, of course, where something you've spent a lot of time working on, and you're an international law professor, but it's very clear that he and the people around him, they want to rewrite the rules for the international order, right? So we get rid of all these trade agreements we've signed, we get rid of the WTO, which is a burden. We want to do whatever you want to do. Yeah. Right? Liberated.
Someone was putting in this, that's a very good way to think about it, because I was in a conversation the other day and someone was telling me, is this idea of international law that has some values and some constraints and some system around it. And if you see, broadly speaking, how the US State Department is speaking about this right now, is the rule-based order. They don't say international law, system, right? Because system implies a relationship between the international trade regime and the regime of state responsibility and the regime of countermeasures and reprisals, and there is a relational aspect. But by thinking in this way as a rule-based order is we are here to get out of the international system, right, what you were saying, and create a rule-based order where we dictate the new rules. The new rules are negotiated bilaterally, and we don't care about the system.
Yeah, and even there I think, okay, so, because that's the other thing that some people in the administration are saying. So this is the first strike in what is going to be a renegotiation of our relationship with all the countries around the world. Right, so you say, okay, fine, we're going to have a deal of some kind, assume that happens. The other thing they've shown is they cannot be trusted, right? So in terms of what is the value of a deal? So yes, so the international legal order is gone, the trading system is what we've built up since the Second World War is no longer relevant for the US. So yes, rules are rules, but our rules can change from day to day, right? So what does that mean? So I think there's really a fundamental tension in what they're trying to do, because on the one hand, if you're really trying to be serious about getting rid of bilateral deficits, you're not going to raise much revenue. By definition, if all trade balance is everywhere, your revenue is going to be zero, in a sense. And in terms of attracting foreign direct investment back into the US, I mean, if rules change all the time and you don't really know where you are, why would you invest?
Right. No, there will not be no certainty and not any trust. No, and I think maybe that's what you're seeing on the markets, right? I mean, with the collapse of the markets in the last few days, and I wonder if that is really gonna change. I think you can think maybe that there is gonna be some companies trying to go back to the U.S. Those that may see a possibility, right? Or maybe Mexico and Canada that seem to be less impacted by the tariffs. But at the same time, I think any company in that have to think twice, as what you're saying, right? If there's really some kind of conditions for a long-term relationship. Because at the same time, Trump is threatening, Canada, and Mexico at the same time, right?
But also, again, it's this incoherence. So let's say you want to attract a lot more investment into the United States, right? You know that a lot of the supply chains are not there. Mm-hmm. You know that a lot of the workers don't have the skills you need to, generate these widgets. So this is really a long-term process. So that's your point. You really need to have a stable investment climate, business environment for that. But at the other hand, you also need to have access to, you can't just say we're going to go from where we are now with a very fragmented, very specialized set of supply chains and we're going to do it all locally, right? So the only way you can kind of get that going faster is what Biden was doing, which is, okay, I'm going to throw a lot of subsidies at this, right? I'm going to create tax incentives. I'm going to actually create incentives for American consumers to buy American stuff. Yeah. Fine. But then again, you listen to the Trump administration and say, oh, that's all bad, right? I also want to get rid of that. So again, it just doesn't, really. So for me, the takeaway really is this is not about economics. This is not about any rational strategy. This is really what we were saying, let's get rid of the rules that exist. We're going to be the big player. We are a big player. We will just dictate what the terms of trade are going to be for anybody who wants to trade with us.
Exactly. And now the question is what other countries will do about this, right? Because it's very easy to, for some countries, you see Argentina now, right? That with a like-minded president, he went and surrendered, basically, with Trump. But what Europe should do, and I think that's the question, right? That's something that makes economic sense, but also prevents this dynamic, no? And maybe from an economic point of view, it makes sense to retaliate, but from a political point of view, maybe not.
Yep.
So what do you think?
Yep. No, it's actually quite interesting if you look at the list of tariffs and at the countries that are being hit by these so-called reciprocal tariffs, which are really on top of the existing tariff regimes, right? And the ones who are being hit the hardest are the countries that have done the most to actually get their internal house in order to develop an export-oriented strategy. And these are developing countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Lesotho. So there are a whole bunch of those countries that have kind of focused on exporting things to the United States, quite frequently American companies located in those countries doing that work, and they're now suddenly hit with a 50% tariff, right? So what can you do? So Vietnam has offered, okay, we hear you, no more tariffs on our side, right? So we will go to 0. Now, and that is going to be interesting. Is that enough?
Because that's not going to rebalance the trade relations,
again, so if the trade deficit dimension is important, then the fact that Vietnam is going to be importing a little bit more of American stuff is not going to change much. So I don't, again, it goes to the incoherence. Can you negotiate? So what kind of a deal would you then make with Vietnam? And that's going to be an interesting question. Now, for the EU, again, it's also interesting. So the EU is going to be hit by 20%. Relative to, let's say, the Vietnams and Cambodias of the world, who are being hit with close to 50% extra tariffs. So what do we do? And again, that's also going to be very interesting, because from an economic point of view, you say, well, if I retaliate, it's going to cost me, right? Because retaliation means I'm going to increase tariffs on our imports, and therefore we're going to be paying more for stuff than we really needed to do, and so why do that, right? So the standard economic argument quite frequently is don't retaliate.
Don't retaliate.
Don't retaliate. Mm-hmm. So if a country, wants to do this, let them incur the cost themselves. It's going to be very costly for the United States, and you're seeing that already in what you were mentioning, the stock market reaction, which is going to feed through into these tariffs are going to feed through into higher prices. That means less employment over time, as, potentially heading into a recession. So in a sense, the Americans are digging a big hole for themselves. So you say, okay, let's just wait and see how that plays out. I think the trouble with that strategy is that this is a person who, if you don't do anything, is just going to escalate, right? So, okay, 20% tariffs on the EU. Next step, Greenland. Next step after that, who knows?
Yeah.
Right? So, and that is one reason I think why we should be retaliating. But I think what the Commission is doing is quite sensible, is to say, okay, we'll take it step by step. We are going to retaliate, but we're not going to go one for one. So we're not going to do what China is doing. So the Chinese are basically saying tit for tat. Yeah. Right, so the Americans raised tariffs on China by an extra 34%. The Chinese came back and said, okay, we're going to do the same thing, 34%. And then if you raise, we will raise.
Yeah.
So I think that's not a situation I think we want to get into, but we could, right? And I think one of the things that is also quite striking about the situation, so I've done a lot of work on trade and services, right? So that's kind of one of my specialties. And it's really striking that services are completely off the radar.
Right, it's products.
Right?
It's products.
So they're obsessed with manufactured goods, agriculture, so tangible products. But the fact is that the United States is a services economy.
Right.
And the United States has a strong comparative advantage in services, and we import a lot of services from the US. So the US has a huge surplus in trade and services with the EU. So that's our kind of obvious opportunity to retaliate if we want to.
Right. No, and then you can think also other retaliations, and here the rules of retaliations are different. If you operate within the framework of the World Trade Organization, whether you want to stay within the framework or get out completely into the law of countermeasures and reprisals. And I think that is some decision that the EU has to do, because if they still within the WTO rules, they have to go first to see if they can retaliate on products, right? And then they can go into different agreements, right? And services and then intellectual property. But there is a possibility, right? And I agree with it would make sense to think of retaliations more in that direction, in the direction that increases the potential of some firms of Europe to gain some advantage. I think the other one that's more interesting is intellectual property rights, whether there could be a suspension of intellectual property rights. What is the economics of that? How do the economists think about the plausible suspension? Because the services, I agree, it's the same logic as products, just in a way that increases the potential of European firms. But the intellectual property has a different context, no?
Yeah, and me personally, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to start fiddling with intellectual property rights. So these are rights, these are contracts, these are, there's a whole, you know this better than I do, there's a whole body of law associated with intellectual property rights. So it seems to be much more straightforward to tax the thing that they actually have a surplus on, and that's services. And then the question becomes, how do you do that? Because obviously you don't tax services as they cross the border. Right, so that's going to have to be some kind of a digital sales tax, services tax. It could be regulatory, whatever. But so that's something that needs to be figured out. But the EU, of course, has the anti-coercion instrument, right, which is a new instrument which allows the Commission to actually retaliate in these types of situations. And that anti-coercion instrument was actually created to respond to the first Trump administration. Right, and since then the focus has mostly been on China in the potential use of this instrument, but it seems like now we're back to where we started from in terms of why we put this in place, which is to be able to respond to what is very much coercion, right, by the United States.
And in your work that you were doing in response to the first Trump administration, did you analyze some of these instruments or the potential of some of these instruments, or
Yeah. So
you proposed them,
yeah,
or
yeah. So going back, the first Trump administration, started this trade war with China, but also put tariffs on steel and aluminum. So in a sense that we had to retaliate against that. So a lot of this has been played out before. The big difference is that now they're doing everything, right? It's across the board tariffs. It's very high tariffs. We've never seen tariffs this high since, I guess, forever, since the 18th century.
Yeah. So in some way, the instruments are very difficult.
Yeah, but we did a lot of work at the time because there is this theory in economics about the optimal tariff.
Yes.
Right, so everybody learns in their introductory economics course that there are gains from trade and that small countries which cannot affect their terms of trade really should, they don't benefit from protection. But if you're a large country, you can. Right, so in theory, if you're a large country, you can impose import restrictions, tariffs, and that might lower the cost of the imports because you're big enough to influence the world market price of this stuff. And the work we were doing at the time is say, okay, let's take this seriously, and can we kind of create a reasonable, rational explanation for what we're seeing, which is embedded in this theory of optimal tariffs, right? Is that what the US is going to do? And the answer was,
no.
We're not even close to what an optimal tariff would look like. Yeah, so it's... but I think we are really now in a completely new situation. And it's not so much about maximizing the terms of trade or dealing with these bilateral trade deficits. Really, like we said in the beginning, they're really trying to change the rules of the game.
Yes, yeah. No, and I think that puts more, it's more dangerous, right? And I think we have to be more concerned about the rhetoric, the escalating rhetoric, especially in terms of Greenland. I think that is a real possibility that the U.S. may use military
Greenland,
force.
Canada, Mexico.
Yeah. No, so in Mexico,
Panama.
Yeah, Panama and Mexico. I think although Mexico is navigating better the trade aspect of this, in part because I think the U.S. recognizes the need of cheap products and cheap vegetables and cheap. Food, right? And but I think it's a different one. It's a potential escalation of this concern over fentanyl that leads into drone attacks into Mexico. And I think you will see a situation like you see in Syria or Afghanistan. We saw in Syria and Afghanistan or Iraq, right, where the U.S. will have a military operation. The infrastructure is there, the rhetoric is there, and the defense aspects of the Department of Defense is really keen on doing that, and they have done that. So I do think that...
okay, so we have an emulation of what Putin is doing in Ukraine then, right? I mean, that's a war.
That is very much, yeah. And I think that is the scary part of this, right? Like we have not been in this for a while, right? In this situation where the U.S. is... an aggressive force against its neighbors, against its partners, against its... it's going to be very difficult. And I agree that we are outside of the world as we know it. Yep. And it's going to be good for our students. They have a lot of things.
Yeah, there'll be lots of scope for research, yes. Because there might actually be some, I wouldn't say silver linings, but there might be some. So one of the things that is obviously happening now is that because of the differentiated nature of this reciprocal tariff, some countries have much lower tariffs than others. Right, and then the real question becomes, okay, so is there enough of an incentive to then relocate production to those countries? And ultimately what is going to matter, I think, for foreign investors is what's the differential tariff I face in the US if I want to export to the US relative to what are the costs of production in these different locations.
You have a situation like in your silver line is like this. During the pandemic, there was a lot of different policies being introduced at different points. It's like, well, that gives you the variation for empirical research.
No, but I think the silver lining here is in a sense, so again, if you go back to who is being hit hardest, It's Asian countries that specialize in apparel.
Right.
Textiles, clothing, labor-intensive production, right? So Cambodia, that's the Cambodia case, the Laos case.
Bangladesh, yeah.
Okay, so then what happens, what the incentive is then, okay, I go to countries that have a much lower tariff. Where are those countries that also have relatively low-cost labor? They're in Africa, right? So some of the African countries might actually benefit from this.
Oh, interesting.
Right, in terms of that type of diversion of investment to serve the U.S. market. So they might potentially benefit. Now, I'm not saying they will, but I think this is the type of analysis that will be useful to do.
I did a little bit of work of textiles, actually, when the agreement on textiles and clothing, the ATC, expired in 2006. I was actually in Ghana looking at the displacement of Ghanaian clothing production by Chinese. And one thing that came true from that report that we wrote at that time was that it was cheaper for China to produce in China and export into Ghana than produce in Ghana, given the infrastructure and not the access. So I think that is another part that...
No, but again, that's why you need to do this. This is really something you need to figure out, which I assume a lot of these companies are going to be doing. So are the costs sufficiently low to benefit from this tariff differential or not? But I think it would also give a trigger, an additional incentive for African countries to actually pursue this regional integration arrangements that they have. So I think the other response that I can see happening, and there's quite a bit of discussion on this, is okay, the United States has taken itself out in terms of being willing to agree to trade agreements. And even if they are, we can't trust them, right? So if you take that as given, the rest of the world, of course, is still embedded in trade agreements, they're still cooperating in the WTO. So there's a lot more scope to actually do things without the US, and I think we're going to see a lot of that being tried.
Yeah,
right?
and
so
I
essentially saying we continue to actually follow a rules-based system where the rules are actually predictable and known, and therefore that will then encourage trade and investment.
And that's the leadership that the European Union could play. I think, no? I mean, like reestablishing that, establishing truth, but I also think they will need to have a key partner on that. And the question here is, are we looking for China as a key partner in this? Is this something that, we're going to have our meeting with our Chinese colleagues, but do you see any potential on that, or you think...
Well, economically, I think it's like, that's an open goal. So I think that is certainly something that we should be doing. And I think if you look at the things we have set as priorities for ourselves in terms of the Green Deal, greening the economy, the fact that China is so far ahead of where we are in terms of battery technologies, in terms of electric vehicles. So it really... Again, one way you could conceive of thinking about, okay, how do we respond to the US is to say, okay, well, maybe we should rethink a bit the approach we've been taking to China and actually do more to cooperate with China, which is not going to be a trade agreement, that's going to be much more difficult, but we can do that on an issue-specific basis, and we could also do it through plurilateral types of cooperation.
It will take some time, but also, it has to be important to see what values would be advanced, and I think in that sense, issue-specific aspects will be more.
No, but I think it's absolutely critical. So, independent of whether we like China or not, and the whole foreign policy dimension to our relationship, which has become a lot worse in the last 5-10 years or so. There's a real need to talk to China because China is the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Now they're being blocked from the US. Now, to a large extent, they already were, right? But now they're basically out. So a lot of that stuff is going to come our way.
The overcapacities has to
so
go
we're going
somewhere.
We're going to have to make, we're going to have to confront this, and it's better to do that in a cooperative fashion than to say, okay, we're going to use a whole plethora of anti-dumping duties, countervailing measures, safeguard measures to stop that stuff. So I think that is something that, again, is a good reason to sit around the table and start discussing, okay, how do we manage this situation?
Right. But that's a more defensive aspect of the relationship. What would be the...
No, but I think it's also, it's potentially so...
Services,
so there's a whole set of issues where I think there are really gains from trade. Right, so they are so far ahead of us now in batteries, apparently. So encourage investment by Chinese companies in
that's already happening.
That's already happening. They're in Hungary, but make that, kind of broaden that out. So I think it does suggest a rethinking of our kind of trade policy stance vis-a-vis China. But then I think we should also remember that, so the United States is a big economy, but it's only 20% of our exports, right? So they are our biggest trading partners, but that means there's 80% in the rest of the world, right? So I think a lot of things can be done with other countries to actually support trade.
Yeah, and so I guess that's the silver lining, no? It's helping us to see that the world is bigger than this North Atlantic world.
The other silver lining, I have no idea whether this is true or not, but that occurred to me in terms of these very high tariffs against textiles and clothing producers. There might actually be an environmental benefit, right?
Yeah.
So if we can cut a bit the fast fashion, less T-shirts in landfills. If that's one of the effects, we might actually end up again. That might be.
Yeah, it will be an irony. It will be an irony, right? That the Trump administration became the greenest by destroying the trading system.
Well, partly because low-income households can no longer afford to consume, right?
Right. It's just like that. On that sad note.
I mean, there are ironies upon ironies in this whole situation. It's really crazy.
Well, I think they left us alone.
Yeah,
Good.
Okay, so cut.